We're discussing about our chapter number 7, which we will be discussing the topic sample design, size, and selection of items for testing. Before that, we can see what is the sampling प्रोसेस. सैम्पलिंग प्रोसेस में क्या होता है, पहले आप डिज़ाइन बनाते हो, फिर सैम्पल साइज डिटरमाइन करते हो, सैम्पल सिलेक्शन मेथड, ऑडिट प्रोसीजर्स, nature and cause of deviation and misstatements, projecting misstatements and evaluating the results of audit sampling. So जब आप सैम्पल डिज़ाइन की बात करते हैं, जब भी आप ऑडिट सैम्पल डिज़ाइन करते हैं, ऑडिटर कंसिडर करेगा द पर्पस ऑफ द ऑडिट प्रोसीजर एंड द कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ द population. Very important. Purpose of the auditor or characteristics of population will be considered, from which the sample will be drawn when you are designing an audit sample. ऑडिटर डिटरमाइन करेगा सैम्पल साइज जो सफिशिएंट होना चाहिए टू रिड्यूस द सैम्पलिंग रिस्क टू एन एक्सेप्टेबली लो लेवल. जब आइटम सेलेक्ट करते हैं तो आप ऐसे सेलेक्ट करो इन सच अ वे दैट ईच सैम्पलिंग यूनिट इन द पॉपुलेशन हैज़ अ चांस ऑफ selection. Sample selected must be representative in population. So when designing an audit sample, the auditor shall consider the purpose of audit procedures and characteristics of the population from which the sample will be drawn. The auditor shall determine a sample size sufficient to reduce the sampling risk to an acceptably low level. The auditor shall select items for sample in such a way that each sampling unit in the population have a chance of selection. Sample selected must be representative of the population. अभी purely sample design, जब आप सैम्पल ऑडिट सैम्पल को डिज़ाइन कर रहे हो, हमने ऑलरेडी देखा कि हमें क्या कंसिडर करना चाहिए, पर्पस एंड कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ पॉपुलेशन. तो व्हेन डिज़ाइनिंग एन ऑडिट सैम्पल द ऑडिटर्स कंसिडरेशन इंक्लूड्स द स्पेसिफिक पर्पस टू बी अचीव्ड and the combination of audit procedures that is likely to best achieve that purpose, right? Auditors consideration include the specific purpose to be achieved and the combination of audit procedures that is likely to best achieve that purpose. Consideration of the nature of audit evidence sought and possible deviation or misstatement conditions or other characteristics related to that audit evidence will assist the auditor in defining what constitutes a deviation or a misstatement and what population to use for सैम्पलिंग. तो सेकेंड पॉइंट क्या बोला था मैंने कि जब आप ऑडिट सैम्पल को डिज़ाइन करते हो आपको कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ पॉपुलेशन भी देखना पड़ता है. तो कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ पॉपुलेशन से आप सैम्पल उठा के यू आर गेटिंग एविडेंस, राइट? सो कंसिडरेशन ऑफ नेचर ऑफ audit evidence sought and a possible deviation or a misstatement conditions or other characteristics relating to that audit evidence will assist the auditor in defining what constitutes a deviation or a misstatement and what population to use for sampling. In fulfilling the requirement of SA 500 audit evidence, when performing audit sampling, auditor performs audit procedures to obtain evidence that the population from which the sample is drawn is complete. कि जब population से sample उठाते हैं तो that sample is complete, right? So the auditor's consideration for the purpose of the audit procedure include a clear understanding of what constitutes a deviation or a misstatement, so that all and only those conditions that are relevant to the purpose of the audit procedures are included in the evaluation of deviation of projection of mistake. Yeah, so this is what you will do जब आप एक सैम्पल ऑडिट सैम्पल को आप डिज़ाइन कर रहे हो. अगेन रिवाइजिंग, व्हेन डिज़ाइनिंग एन ऑडिट सैम्पल द ऑडिटर्स कंसिडरेशन इंक्लूड द स्पेसिफिक पर्पस टू बी अचीव्ड एंड द कॉम्बिनेशन ऑफ ऑडिट प्रोसीजर्स दैट इज लाइकली टू बेस्ट अचीव द पर्पस. Then consideration of the nature of audit evidence sought and the possible deviation or misstatement conditions or other characteristics relating to that audit evidence will assist the auditor in defining what constitutes a deviation or a misstatement and what population to use for sampling. In fulfilling the requirement of SA 500 audit evidence, when performing audit sampling, the auditor performs audit procedures to obtain evidence that the population from which the audit sample drawn is complete. तो audit sample complete होना चाहिए. Auditor's consideration for the purpose of audit procedure includes a clear understanding of what constitutes a deviation or a misstatement, so that all and only those conditions that are relevant to the purpose of the audit procedures are included in the evaluation of deviation or projection of misstatements, right? Next is, therefore, इन कंसिडरिंग द कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ पॉपुलेशन. तो पहले तो पर्पस का देखा, अभी कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स का हम देखेंगे, राइट? सो इन कंसिडरिंग द कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ द पॉपुलेशन for test of controls, the auditor makes an assessment of the expected rate of deviation based on the auditor's understanding of the relevant controls or on the examination of small number of items from population. This assessment is made in order to design an audit sample and to determine sample size. For example, if the expected rate of deviation is unacceptably high, the auditor will normally decide not to perform test of controls. तो rate of deviation ज़्यादा है तो test of controls perform करने की ज़रूरत ही नहीं है. Similarly, in test of details, the auditor makes an assessment of expected misstatement in the population. If the expected misstatement is high, 100% examination or use of large sample size may be appropriate when performing test of details, right? So this is all about your sample size. Again, I hope it is very clear कि यहाँ पे purpose की बात होती है और characteristics of population की बात होती है. Characteristics of population में test of control में आप assessment करोगे expected rate of deviation, और rate of deviation unacceptably high है तो you will not include test of controls. Test of details में अगर expected misstatement देखोगे, अगर है हाई है तो आप 100% एग्जामिनेशन और यूज ऑफ अ लार्ज सैम्पल साइज may be appropriate when performing test of details, right? So this was all about your sample design, right? Next is regarding stratification and वैल्यू वेटेड सिलेक्शन. हमने सेकेंड चीज़ देखा था, पहले तो पर्पस स्पेसिफिक पर्पस था टू बी अचीव्ड एंड द कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ पॉपुलेशन. तो वही कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ पॉपुलेशन में से अगर आपको सैम्पल ड्रॉ करना है तो ऑडिटर डिटरमाइन करेगा कि वो सैम्पल एदर थ्रू स्ट्रैटिफिकेशन और वैल्यू वेटेड सिलेक्शन टेक्निक इज अप्रोप्रिएट. या व्हाट इज स्ट्रैटिफिकेशन? पहले तो ऑडिट एफिशिएंसी. ऑडिट एफिशिएंसी मे बी इम्प्रूव्ड इफ द ऑडिटर स्ट्रैटिफाइज अ पॉपुलेशन बाय डिवाइडिंग इट इनटू डिस्क्रीट सब पॉपुलेशंस which have an identifying characteristics. What is the objective of stratification? To reduce the variability of items within each stratum and therefore allow sample size to be reduced without increasing sampling risk. When performing test of details, population is often stratified by monetary value. Test of details perform करे तो population is often stratified by monetary value. This allows greater audit effort to be directed towards larger value items, as these items may contain the greatest potential misstatement in terms of overstatement. Similarly, a population may be stratified according to a particular characteristics that indicate a higher risk of material misstatement. For example, when testing the allowance of doubtful accounts and valuation of accounts receivable balances may be stratified by age. Stratification का definition क्या होगा? Dividing a population into discrete subpopulation which have identifying characteristics is called stratification. Each subpopulation is called a stratum and units under those subpopulation are referred to as strata. So the result of the audit procedures applied to a sample of items within a stratum, या तो सब पॉपुलेशन के अंदर ऊपर आप ऑडिट प्रोसीजर्स जो अप्लाई करते हो, ओनली बी प्रोजेक्टेड टू द आइटम्स दैट मेक अप द स्ट्राटम. To draw a conclusion on the entire population, the auditor will need to consider the risk of material misstatement in relation to whatever other strata make up the entire population. तो चार पांच सब पॉपुलेशन या स्ट्रैटम्स बनाए होंगे. एक स्ट्रैटम पे ऑडिट प्रोसीजर्स अप्लाई कर रहे हो तो वो उसका प्रोजेक्शन सिर्फ उस स्ट्रैटम तक ही होगा, लेकिन एंटायर पॉपुलेशन का करना है तो आप कंसिडर करोगे मटेरियल मिसस्टेटमेंट रिलेशन टू अदर स्ट्रैटाज एज वेल, which to whatever other strata make up the entire population. The results of samples that from the units drawn from each subpopulation are projected to the respective stratum. In order to draw an opinion on the overall population, the auditor needs to combine the results of all the stratum to check for possible deviation or risk of material misstatement. Projected misstatements of each stratum will be combined together to consider the possible effect of misstatement on the accounts balances and class of transactions. Next is regarding value weighted selection. When performing टेस्ट, इधर सिर्फ टेस्ट ऑफ डिटेल्स की बात था कि क्योंकि मॉनेटरी वैल्यूज टेस्ट ऑफ डिटेल्स में ही होता है. When performing test of details, it may be efficient to identify the sampling unit as the individual monetary unit that makes up the population. Having selected specific monetary units from within the population, for example, account receivable balance, the auditor may then examine the particular items, for example, individual balances that contain those monetary units. One benefit of the approach is to defining the sampling unit is the audit effort is directed to the larger value items because they have a greater chance of selection and can result in smaller sample sizes. This approach may be used in conjunction with the systematic method of sample selection. May be used in conjunction with the systematic method of sample selection and is most efficient when selecting items using random selection. So in value weighted selection, the sample size, its selection and evaluation will result in a conclusion in monetary amount. So this is all about your sample design. Don't forget, sample design में हमने क्या क्या पढ़ा है, that regarding कि when you design an audit sample, auditor considers this purpose, then the consideration of audit evidence obtained and sample should be complete. एंड कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स को कंसिडर करते हो तो टेस्ट ऑफ कंट्रोल्स में क्या होगा, टेस्ट ऑफ डिटेल्स में क्या होगा. अभी उसी कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ पॉपुलेशन में से अगर आपको सैम्पल ड्रॉ करना है तो ऑडिटर कंसिडर करेगा स्ट्रैटिफिकेशन या तो वैल्यू वेटेड सिलेक्शन. स्ट्रैटिफिकेशन में ऑडिट एफिशिएंसी इंप्रूव होती है. ऑब्जेक्टिव क्या होता है, वेरिएबिलिटी ऑफ आइटम्स को रिड्यूस करना. टेस्ट ऑफ डिटेल्स हमेशा स्ट्रैटिफाई किया जाता है बाय मॉनिटरी वैल्यूज. एफर्ट इज डायरेक्टेड टुवर्ड्स लार्जर वैल्यू ऑफ आइटम्स, राइट, एंड अकॉर्डिंगली. और ये करेक्ट इनकरेक्ट के लिए इंपॉर्टेंट है कि अगर आप रिजल्ट ऑफ सैम्पल फॉर यूनिट्स ड्रॉन अंडर ईच सब पॉपुलेशन आर प्रोजेक्टेड टू द रिस्पेक्टिव स्ट्रैटम ओनली. अगर आपको ओपिनियन बनाना है ओवरऑल पॉपुलेशन के ऊपर, ऑडिटर नीड्स टू डिटरमाइन द रिजल्ट ऑफ ऑल द स्ट्रैटम टू चेक फॉर द पॉसिबल डिविएशन और रिस्क ऑफ मटेरियल misstatement. Projected misstatement of each stratum will be combined together to consider the possible effect of misstatement in the account balances and class of transactions. Similarly, the same goes with your value weighted selection. So I hope the sample design part is clear in the sampling process. Okay, now we will discuss our next up. First we discussed about sample design. Now we will discuss about sample size. हमने already introduction में पढ़ा था कि auditor determine करेगा sample size that is sufficient to reduce the sampling risk to an acceptably low level. The level of sampling risk the auditor is willing to accept affects the sample size required. Now, the lower the risk the auditor is willing to accept, the greater the sample size will need to be. सैम्पल साइज को डिटरमाइन करना है तो आप डिटरमाइन कर सकते हो, लेकिन बाय द एप्लीकेशन ऑफ either by a statistically based formula or through the exercise of professional judgment. There are various factors typically having on the determination of sample size. Sample size को determine करना है तो बहुत सारे factors भी है. अगर circumstances similar है, the effect on sample size of factors will be similar regardless of whether a statistical or non-statistical approach is chosen. तो correct incorrect के लिए important है. जब circumstances are similar, the effect on the sample size of factors will be similar regardless of whether a statistical or a non-statistical approach is chosen. Examples of factors influencing sample size for test of control. So test of control से related क्या sample size होना चाहिए उसके कुछ examples discuss किए गए हैं और the factors have been discussed. The following are factors that the auditor may consider when determining the sample size for test of controls. What sample size for test of controls? These factors need to be considered together. Assume that the auditor does not modify the nature or timing of test of controls or otherwise modify the approach to substantive procedures in response to the assessed risk. तो we will discuss the factors that the auditor may consider when determining the size of test of controls, right? When there is a, so first factor या example क्या होगा, when there is an increase in the extent to which the auditor's risk assessment takes into account the relevant कंट्रोल। तो कौन किस हद तक या किस हद तक का एक्सटेंड होना चाहिए टू टेस्ट द कंट्रोल्स, या so when there is an increase in the extent to which the auditor's risk assessment takes into account relevant control, क्या होगा, the more assurance the auditor intends to obtain from the operating effectiveness of control, lower the auditor's risk assessment of risk of material misstatement will be and the larger sample size will need to be। तो इधर क्या लिखा है, अगर assurance more assurance चाहिए about the operating effectiveness of control, lower will be the auditor's risk assessment of risk of material misstatement and larger the sample size needs to be। ठीक है, when the auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement at assertion level includes an expectation of operating effectiveness of control, the auditor is required to check for the test of controls। अदर, ठीक है, फिर ये वापस उन्होंने सम अप किया है कि अगर ग्रेटर रिलायंस द ऑडिटर places on the operating effectiveness of control and risk assessment, the greater will be the extent of the auditor's test of control and the sample size will increase। अगर कंट्रोल्स पे ज़्यादा रिलाई करना है तो एक्सटेंट भी ज़्यादा करना पड़ेगा, और एक्सटेंट ज़्यादा है तो सैम्पल साइज भी ज़्यादा होगा, या so when there is an increase in the extent to which the auditor's risk assessment takes into account relevant controls, the more assurance auditor intends to obtain from the operating effectiveness of controls, the lower the auditor's risk assessment of risk of material misstatement will be and larger the sample size will need to be। When the auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement at the assertion level includes an expectation of operating effectiveness of controls, the auditor is required to see the test of controls। Other things being equal, greater the reliance the auditor places on the operating effectiveness of controls in risk assessment, the greater is the extent of the auditor's test of controls and the sample size will increase। Next, टॉलरेबल रेट ऑफ डिविएशन क्या होता है कि इतना डिविएशन हुआ तो ठीक है, ऑडिटर टॉलरेट कर सकता है, उससे ऊपर वो टॉलरेट नहीं कर पा रहा है। तो इफ़ देयर इज एन इंक्रीज, अगर ज़्यादा टॉलरेट कर रहा है रेट ऑफ डिविएशन तो सैम्पल साइज डिक्रीज हो सकती है। अगर आप लोअर रेट टॉलरेबल रेट ऑफ डिविएशन लेते हो तो लार्जर सैम्पल साइज नीड्स टू बी। टॉलरेबल एरर इज द मैक्सिमम एरर इन द पॉपुलेशन द ऑडिटर इज रेडी टू एक्सेप्ट इन अ गिवन सैम्पल साइज। Smaller the tolerable error, larger will be the sample size। So again revising, if there is an increase in the tolerable rate of deviation, the sample size will decrease। As lower the tolerable rate of deviation, larger the sample size needs to be। Tolerable error is the maximum error in the population the auditor is ready to accept in a given sample size। Smaller the tolerable error, larger will be the sample size। Next, अगर रेट ऑफ डिविएशन अगर वो इंक्रीज होता है तो क्या होगा, when there is an increase in the expected rate of deviation of the population to be tested, the sample size will increase। अगर रेट ऑफ डिविएशन ज़्यादा है तो सैम्पल साइज भी इंक्रीज होगा। as the higher the expected rate of deviation, larger the sample size needs to be, so that the auditor is in a position to make a reasonable estimate of the actual rate of deviation। Factors relevant to auditor's consideration of the expected rate of deviation include, तो expected rate of deviation से relevant factors क्या हो सकते हैं? Auditor's understanding of the business, changes in personnel or internal control, the results of audit procedures applied in prior periods, and the results of other audit procedures। High expected control deviation rate ordinarily warrants a reduction of assessed risk of material misstatement। So I hope it is clear. When there is an increase in the expected rate of deviation of the population to be tested, the sample size will increase। As the higher the expected rate of deviation, the larger the sample size needs to be। so that the auditor is in a position to make a reasonable estimate of the actual rate of deviation. Factors relevant to auditor's consideration of the expected rate of deviation include the auditor's understanding of the business, changes in personnel or internal control, the results of audit procedures applied in prior periods, and the results of other audit procedures. High expected control deviation rates ordinarily warrant little of any reduction of assets risk of material misstatement. Next example that we would discuss is regarding an increase in the auditor's desired level of assurance. ज़्यादा assurance चाहिए than the tolerable rate of deviation is not exceeded by the actual rate of deviation in the population will increase the sample size. तो इधर क्या डिस्कस किया है कि ऑडिटर का जो assurance है than the tolerable rate of deviation वो नीचे assurance नीचे है from the actual rate of deviation, then the sample size will increase. Yeah, so an increase in the auditor's desired level of assurance than the tolerable rate of deviation is not exceeded by the actual rate of deviation in the population, the sample size will increase. So greater level of assurance that the auditor desires that the results of the sample are in fact indicative of the actual incidence of deviation in the population, the larger sample size needs to be. तो ज़्यादा assurance चाहिए तो sample का result जो indicate करना चाहिए actual deviation को, उसके लिए sample size को बड़ा रखना पड़ेगा. अभी in case of large populations, the actual size of population has little effect on the sample size. तो large populations की जब बात आती है, actual size of population has little effect on the sample size. लेकिन जब small populations की बात आती है, audit sampling may not be as efficient as alternative means of obtaining sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. Therefore, there will be negligent effect on the sample size due to increase in the number of sampling units in the population. तो large population की बात आएगी तो actual size of population has little effect on the sample size. लेकिन जब small populations की बात आती है, audit sampling may not be as efficient as alternative means of obtaining sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. Therefore, there will be negligent effect on sample size due to increase in number of sampling units in the population. So these were the examples of factors that influence sample size for test of control. पहले क्या देखा, एक्सटेंट देखा, फिर टॉलरेबल रेट ऑफ डिविएशन देखा, फिर रेट ऑफ डिविएशन देखा, फिर ये अश्योरेंस लेवल दैन द टॉलरेबल रेट ऑफ डिविएशन अगर एक्सीड नहीं करता है from the actual rate of deviation, the sample size needs to be increased, and then your large populations and small population. अभी कुछ examples of factors influencing sample size for test of details. So following are the factors that the auditor may consider when determining the sample size for test of details. These factors which need to be considered together, assuming that the auditor does not modify the approach of test of controls or otherwise modify the nature or timing of substantive procedures in response to the assessed risk. So higher the auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement is affected by inherent risk and control risk, the larger the sample size needs to be. अगर ये जो ऑडिटर का असेसमेंट है अगर वो ज़्यादा इफेक्ट होता है बाय इनहेरेंट एंड कंट्रोल रिस्क तो ऑफकोर्स सैम्पल साइज बड़ा चाहिए, राइट. सो द हायर द ऑडिटर्स असेसमेंट ऑफ रिस्क ऑफ मटेरियल मिसस्टेटमेंट इज अफेक्टेड बाय इनहेरेंट रिस्क एंड कंट्रोल रिस्क, the larger the sample size needs to be. For example, if auditor does not perform test of controls, the auditor's risk assessment cannot be reduced for the operating effectiveness of control with respect to a particular assertion. Therefore, in order to reduce the audit risk to an acceptably low level, the auditor needs to lower the detection risk, that is, identify the flaws, and will rely more on the substantive procedures. The more audit evidence that is obtained from test of details, that is lower the detection risk, the larger the sample size needs to be. तो टेस्ट ऑफ डिटेल से अगर आपको ज़्यादा एविडेंस मिल रहा है तो सैम्पल साइज बड़ा होना चाहिए. So you can say that there will be increase in sample size in case there is an increase in the auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement. So this is your first example. What did we discuss here? The higher the auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement is affected by inherent risk and control risk, the larger the sample size needs to be. If auditor does not perform test of control, the auditor's risk assessment cannot be reduced for the operating effectiveness of control with respect to a particular assertion. Therefore, in order to reduce the audit risk to an acceptably low level, the auditor needs to low detection risk and will rely more on substantive procedures. The more audit evidence that is obtained from test of details, the larger the sample size needs to be. Thus, we can say that there will be an increase in sample size in case of increase in auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement. The more auditor is relying on other substantive procedures to reduce to an acceptably low level the detection risk regarding a particular population, the less assurance auditor will require from sampling, and therefore smaller the sample size can be. Hence, if there is an increase in the use of other substantive procedures directed at same assertion, the size of the sample will decrease. तो अगर ज़्यादा rely कर रहा है वो substantive audit अदर substantive procedures के ऊपर, तो less assurance auditor require करेगा from sampling और उसकी वजह से smaller होगा sample size. क्यों? क्योंकि वो ज़्यादा rely कर रहे हैं on the other substantive procedures. Next, an increase in the desired level of assurance than the tolerable misstatement is not exceeded by the actual misstatement. ऊपर क्या था? Actual rate of deviation. यहाँ misstatement will increase the sample size. Hence, greater the level of assurance that the auditor requires that the result of sample are in fact indicative of the actual amount of misstatement in population, the larger the sample size needs to be. So I hope it is clear. Desired level of assurance is not exceeded by the actual misstatement will increase the sample size. Next, an increase in the tolerable misstatement will decrease the sample size. Lower the tolerable misstatement, larger the sample size needs to be. अगर टॉलरेबल मिसस्टेटमेंट इंक्रीज है, लाइक इतना तो मैं टॉलरेट कर सकता हूँ, तो सैम्पल साइज छोटा होगा. टॉलरेट ही नहीं कर पाऊंगा, लोअर है तो लार्जर द सैम्पल साइज. द ग्रेटर द अमाउंट ऑफ मिसस्टेटमेंट द ऑडिटर एक्सपेक्ट टू फाइंड इन द पॉपुलेशन, कि मेरे को तो ढूंढना ही है ज़्यादा मिसस्टेटमेंट, तो larger the sample size needs to be in order to make a reasonable estimate of actual amount of misstatement in population. Factors relevant to the auditor's consideration of expected misstatement include the following, to which the item values are determined subjectively: the result of RAP, the result of TOC, the result of AP applied at trial period, and the result of other substantive procedures. So sample size will increase in case of increase in the amount of misstatement that the auditor expects to find in the population. ठीक है. Next, when stratification of population is appropriate, the sample size will decrease. अगर stratification आपने बराबर से किया तो of course the sample size will decrease. As when there is a wide range of monetary size of items in population, it may be useful to stratify the population. When the population can be appropriately stratified, the aggregate of sample sizes from the strata generally will be less than the sample size that would have been required to attain a gaining level of sampling risk had one sample been drawn from the whole population. Yeah, so I hope it is clear. जब stratification appropriate होता है तो sample size will decrease. There will be negligent effect on sample size due to number of sampling units on the population. For larger population, the actual size of population has little effect on sample size. For smaller population, audit sampling is often not as efficient as alternative means of obtaining sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. However, when using monetary unit sampling, an increase in the monetary value of the population increases the sample size unless this is offset by a proportional increase in materiality for the financial statements as a whole. So these are the examples of factors that influence the sample size for tested details. Okay, quickly revision to banta hai because it is important. What did we learn? Auditors have determined sample size sufficient to reduce sampling risk when acceptably low level. The level of sampling risk the auditor is willing to accept affect the sample size required. The lower the risk the auditor is willing to accept, the greater the sample size will need to be. So in circumstance sample size determine करना है तो it can be by application of या तो statistically based formula या through professional judgment. ठीक है, बहुत सारे factors हैं जो जिसके हेल्प से आप sample size determine कर सकते हो. In circumstances are similar, the effect on sample size of the factor will be similar regardless of whether statistical or non-statistical approach. What are the factors over in case of test of controls? कुछ points पढ़े थे और in case of test of details हमने कुछ points पढ़े थे. So this is all about your sample size. Step in sampling process. First is sample design, then your sample size. Sample size कैसे डिटरमाइन करोगे वो टेस्ट ऑफ कंट्रोल तो टेस्ट ऑफ डिटेल्स के बारे में हमने दिखा. अब सैम्पल साइज डिसाइड तो कर लिया, लेकिन अब आइटम्स कैसे सेलेक्ट करोगे, दैट्स अ बिग क्वेश्चन. सो सेलेक्शन ऑफ आइटम्स फॉर टेस्टिंग. The auditors shall select items for sample in such a way that each sampling unit in the population has a chance of selection. With statistical sampling, sample items are selected in a way that each sample unit has a known probability of being selected. तो statistical sampling use करोगे तो that is each sampling unit has a known probability of being selected. With non-statistical sampling जाओगे तो judgment is used to select the sample items, because the purpose of sampling is to provide a reasonable basis for the auditor to draw conclusions about the population from which the sample is selected. तो पर्पस क्या है, रीजनेबल बेसिस चाहिए ताकि वो ऑडिटर ड्रॉ कंक्लूजन कर पाए अबाउट द पॉपुलेशन जिसके अंदर से सैम्पल को सेलेक्ट किया गया है. इट इज इम्पॉर्टेंट दैट द ऑडिटर सेलेक्ट अ रिप्रेजेंटेटिव सैम्पल. कौन सा सैम्पल, representative sample, so that bias is avoided by choosing sample items which have typical characteristics of population. तो sample ऐसे choose करना चाहिए जिसका होता है typical characteristics of the population. The principal methods of selecting sample, principal methods कौन से हैं? Random selection, systematic selection and haphazard selection. Random selection, systematic selection and haphazard selection. So these are selection of items for testing. Again giving it a read. The auditor shall select items from for the sample in such a way that each sampling unit is in the population has a chance of selection. With statistical sampling, sample items are selected in a way that each sampling unit has a known probability of being selected. With non-statistical sampling, judgment is used to select samples items, because the purpose of sampling is to provide a reasonable basis for the auditor to draw conclusions about the populations from which the sample is selected. It is important that the auditor selects a representative sample so that bias is avoided by choosing sample items which have typical characteristics of the population. Principal methods क्या होंगे? Random, systematic and haphazard. अभी सेलेक्ट करना है आइटम्स. अभी आइटम सेलेक्ट करना है तो वो फर्दर आपके कुछ सिलेक्शन मेथड डिस्कस किए गए हैं. Sample should be selected in such a manner that is representative of the population from which the sample is being selected. It will necessitate that each item in the population have an equal chance of being included in the sample. तो क्या होगी sample selection? Random, systematic, monetary unit sampling, haphazard sampling, block sampling. What is random sampling? Random selection ensures that all items in the population or within each stratum have a known chance of selection. It may involve use of random number tables. So what is random sampling? Random selection ensures that all items in the population or within each stratum have a known chance of selection. It may involve the use of random number table. There are two types of random sampling, that is simple random sampling, stratified sampling. What is simple random sampling? Under this method, each unit of whole population has an equal chance of being selected. It is considered that random number tables are simple and easy to use and also provide assurance that auditor's bias does not affect the selection. Auditor का bias होता है वो selection को affect नहीं करता है under random sampling. Each item in a population is selected by use of random number table either with the help of computer or picking up a number in a random way. Today, random numbers are also generated using various applications of cell phones like random number generator. This method is considered appropriate provided the population to be sampled consists of reasonably similar and fall within a reasonable range. That is, it is suitable for homogeneous population having a similar range. तो random sampling कब जाओगे? Homogeneous population होना चाहिए, right? Similar population होना चाहिए. Therefore, population can be considered homogeneous if the trade receivable balances follow within the range of 55 to 2,25,000 and not in the range between 525 to 10,50,000, right? So this is all about your simple random sampling. Now, what is stratified sampling? This method involves dividing the whole population. स्ट्रैटिफाइड सैम्पलिंग, स्ट्रैटिफिकेशन में क्या होता है, हम स्ट्रैटाज में डिवाइड करते हैं, सिमिलर ब्लॉक्स बनाते हैं और उन्हीं ब्लॉक सिमिलर स्ट्रैटम्स में से हम लेते हैं सैम्पल. सो दिस मेथड इज involves dividing the whole population to be tested in a few separate groups called strata and taking a sample from each of them. Each stratum is treated as it was a separate population. If proportionate of items are selected from each of these stratum, the number of groups into which the whole population has to be divided is determined on the basis of auditor's judgment. In the above case, trade receivables may be divided into 4 groups, that is 10 लाख से ऊपर, फिर 7 लाख से 10 लाख के बीच में, 5 लाख से 7 लाख के बीच में, 2 लाख से 5 लाख के बीच में और 2 लाख के नीचे. From these above groups, the auditor may pick up different percentage of items from each of the group. For example, balances is in excess of 10 lakhs. The auditor may examine all the items. For the second group, 25% of the items can be checked. Third group में 10%, lowest group में 2%. Random sample is chosen from each stratum using random number tables. तो हर stratum में से वो random sampling apply करके लेते हैं samples using random number tables. The reason behind stratified sampling is that for a highly diversified population, अगर highly diversified population है, weights should be allocated to reflect these differences. This is achieved by selecting different proportions from each strata. It can be seen that this is achieved by selecting different proportions from each strata. It can be seen that stratified sampling is simply an extension of simple random sampling. Stratification means dividing heterogeneous population into homogeneous subpopulation where samples are drawn from each subpopulation. Therefore, we can say that random selection method is applied through random number generators, for example, random number tables. So this is all about random sampling. Next is systematic sampling. Systematic sampling. Just a second. इंटरवल सैम्पलिंग और सिस्टमैटिक सैम्पलिंग. अभी इंटरवल सैम्पलिंग या सिस्टमैटिक सैम्पलिंग में क्या होता है? सिस्टमैटिक selection is a selection method in which number of sampling units in the population is divided by the sample size to give a sampling interval. For example, 50, and having determined a starting point within the first 50, each 50th sampling unit thereafter is selected. So her 50th sampling unit thereafter is selected. Although the starting point may be determined haphazardly, the sample is more likely to be truly random if it is determined by the use of a computerized random number generator or random number tables. When using systematic selection, the auditor would need to determine that sampling units with the population are not structured. Very important. जब आप ये systematic लेते हो तो sampling units structured नहीं होने चाहिए. In such a way that the sampling interval corresponds with a particular pattern in the population. To minimize the effect of the possible known bias through a pattern in the population, more than one starting point may be taken. The multiple random starting point is taken because it minimizes the risk of interval sampling pattern with that of the population being sampled. So this is all about your interval sampling or systematic sampling. Next, it is your monetary sampling. What does monetary sampling talk about? इट इज़ अ टाइप ऑफ अ वैल्यू वेटेड सिलेक्शन. देखा था ना वैल्यू वेटेड में कैसे टेस्ट ऑफ डिटेल से आप स्ट्रैटिफाई करते हो बाय मॉनेटरी वैल्यूज, वैसे ही इट इज़ अ टाइप ऑफ वैल्यू वेटेड सिलेक्शन इन विच द सैम्पल साइज सिलेक्शन एंड इवैल्यूएशन रिजल्ट्स इन अ conclusion in monetary amounts. Next is what is haphazard sampling. Auditor selects the sample without following a structured technique. Although no structured technique is used, the auditor would nevertheless avoid any conscious bias or predictability. Example, avoiding difficult to locate items, or always choosing or avoiding the first or last pages on entries on the page, and thus attempt to ensure that all items in the population have a chance of selection. Haphazard selection is not appropriate when using statistical sampling. Haphazard sampling has no structured approach, does not involve judgment, and does not even use random number tables. Last one is block sampling. This method involves selection of blocks of contiguous items from within the population. So this method involves selection of blocks of contiguous items from within the population. Block selection cannot ordinarily be used in audit sampling because most populations are structured such that the items in a sequence can be expected to have similar characteristics to each other, but different characteristics from items elsewhere in the population. तो इसीलिए block selection cannot ordinarily be used in audit sampling because most populations are structured such that items in a sequence can be expected to have similar characteristics to each other, but different characteristics of items elsewhere in the population. Although in some circumstances it may be an appropriate audit procedure. कुछ circumstances में ये appropriate हो सकता है to examine a block of items. It would rarely be an appropriate sample selection technique when the auditor intends to draw valid inferences about the entire population based on the sample. Usually, a range of continuous transactions shall have similar characteristics. Therefore, selection of a group at one time will not give a reasonable basis. So, क्योंकि range of continuous transactions shall have similar characteristics होता है, तो selection of a group at one time will not give a reasonable basis for the opinion on overall population, as different types of transactions and unusual transactions may not be covered in the group taken all at one. Further, if the client has the idea, अगर client को पता चल गया about the block selection pattern of the auditor, and the material misstatement and the deviation can be easily overlooked by management's practice of recording them. Example, taking first 200 sales invoices from the sales daybook in the month of September, alternatively taking any 4 block of 50 sales invoices. Therefore, once the first item in the block is selected, the rest of the block follows items of the completion. Thus, there is a close similarity between this method and the non-statistical sampling. Consequently, it has similar characteristics, namely simplicity and economy. On the other hand, there is a risk of bias and establishing a pattern of selection which may not be noted by the auditors. तो bias होता है block sampling के अंदर भी, like the non-statistical sampling. So this is all about your block sampling. So these are your various sample selection method: random, interval or system, monetary unit sampling, haphazard sampling, and your block sampling. After that, we will discuss about sample selection methods हो गया. Now we will discuss about sampling risk and non-sampling risk. What is sampling risk? The risk that the auditor's conclusion based on the sample may be different from the conclusion of the entire population were subjected to the same audit procedure. Yeah, so what is sampling risk? The risk that the auditor's conclusion based on the sample may be different from the conclusion if the entire population were subjected to same audit procedure. The risk will always be in existence when this risk will always, no matter what, always will be in existence when the auditor uses sampling technique in conducting his audit. So if the acceptable sampling risk is low, the larger sample size is needed. Sampling risk can lead to two types of erroneous conclusion. In case of test of controls, क्या erroneous conclusion auditor दे सकता है that controls are more effective than they actually are. In case of test of details, that a material misstatement does not exist when in fact it does. The auditor is primarily concerned with this type of erroneous conclusion because it affects the audit effectiveness and it is more likely to lead an inappropriate audit opinion. This is because of over reliance of internal कंट्रोल. ठीक है, ओवर रिलायंस ऑफ इंटरनल कंट्रोल. तो क्या एरोनियस कंक्लूजन दोगे टेस्ट ऑफ कंट्रोल्स में? टेस्ट ऑफ कंट्रोल्स ज़्यादा इफेक्टिव है, वाह भाई वाह, दैन द एक्चुअली आर. द मटेरियल स्टेटमेंट डज नॉट एग्जिस्ट व्हेन इन फैक्ट इट डज. जैसे इधर पॉजिटिव बात करते हैं, राइट, कि ज़्यादा इफेक्टिव है, मटेरियल स्टेटमेंट नहीं है. तो the auditor is primarily concerned with this type of erroneous conclusion because it affects audit effectiveness and is more likely to lead an inappropriate audit opinion. This is because of over reliance of internal controls. So risk of over reliance on test of controls, risk of incorrect acceptance affects the effectiveness of audit. It leads to an erroneous audit opinion. इधर क्या होता है दूसरा टाइप, इन केस ऑफ टेस्ट ऑफ कंट्रोल्स लेस इफेक्टिव है दैन ये बोलते हो दैन दे एक्चुअली आर. मटेरियल स्टेटमेंट एग्जिस्ट करता है व्हेन इट फैक्ट इट डज नॉट. तो इधर नेगेटिव साइड बोला. दिस टाइप ऑफ एरोनियस कंक्लूजन अफेक्ट्स द ऑडिट एफिशिएंसी.